Women's suffrage was an important historical moment which allowed women to finally be treated as equals to men. The women's suffrage began as nothing but the idea that women should have an equal say in the governance of the country and the laws that affected them. Women's suffrage was a decades-long campaign involving activism and protests, among other tactics, in the fight for women's equality and rights, especially for the right to vote. It began as a grassroots movement in the decades leading up to the Civil War somewhere in the 1820s to 1830s. In 1848, a group of abolitionist activists, mostly women but some men, gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the problem of women's rights. In 1869, a new group called the National Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution beyond the power of any state to deny. The preamble of the federal Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them. Not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty, while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot. For any state to make sex a qualification that must ever result in the disfranchisement of one entire half of the people is to pass a bill of attainder or an ex post facto law, and is therefore a violation of the supreme law of the land. By it, the blessings of liberty are forever withheld from women and their female posterity. To them, this government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe. An oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning where the educated govern the ignorant, or even an oligarchy of race where the Saxon rules the African, might be endured. But this oligarchy of sex, which makes father, brothers, husbands, sons, the oligarchs over the mother and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household, which ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home of the nation. Webster, Worcester, and Bouvier all define a citizen to be a person in the United States entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say that they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has a right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void, precisely as is every one against Negroes.
Susan B. Anthony was a champion of temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, and equal pay for equal work. Susan Brownell Anthony became one of the most visible leaders of the women's suffrage movement. Along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she traveled around the country delivering speeches in favor of women's suffrage. Anthony and Stanton co-founded the American Equal Rights Association. In 1868, they became editors of the association's newspaper, The Revolution, which helped to spread the ideas of equality and rights for women. Anthony began to lecture, to raise money for publishing the newspaper, and to support the suffrage movement. She became famous throughout the country. Many people admired her, yet others hated her ideas.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an author, a lecturer, and a chief philosopher for the women's rights and suffrage movement, formulated the agenda for women's rights that guided the struggle well into the 20th century. Stanton authored the Declaration of Sentiments, which expanded the Declaration of Independence by adding the word woman or women throughout this pivotal document, called for social and legal changes to elevate women's place in society, and listed 18 grievances from the inability to control their wages and property, or the difficulty in gaining custody, in divorce, and of the lacking of the right to vote. That same year, Stanton circulated petitions throughout New York to urge the New York Congress to pass the New York Married Women's Property Act.
The men and women who opposed women's suffrage did so for many reasons. Many believed that men and women were fundamentally different, and that women should not sully themselves in the dirty world of politics. Others argued that most women did not want the vote, and that only a few, mostly radical women would use it. This thread of argument worked in conjunction with the argument that men could not grant suffrage to only those they deemed worthy. Instead, women's suffrage raised the possibility that all women would receive their ballots at the same time, without racial, educational, or class distinctions. This frightened those in power, especially the whites of the South. Others also acted out of self-interest when working against women's suffrage. Specifically, many industrialists, distillers, and brewers felt threatened by the reforming potential of women voters. Believing that women were different from men and would act out their natural maternal instinct to prohibit alcohol consumption, interfere in business practices, and regulate working conditions and hours.
Ringing the Justice Bell, a True Story, by Tara Vidian, with art by Ellen T. Crenshaw. Women won the right to vote 100 years ago, thanks in part to the Justice Bell. In 1915, Catherine Wentworth Ruschenberger had the Justice Bell made. It was like the Liberty Bell, but without the crack. The Liberty Bell had been on tours across America. Big crowds came to see it. Mrs. Ruschenberger also wanted big crowds to hear about her cause. Her cause was women's suffrage, women's right to vote. In most states, only men could vote. She chained the clapper inside the bell so no one could ring it until the struggle was won. That year, the men of Pennsylvania were going to vote on women's suffrage. The Justice Bell toured the state. Crowds came, but in November, the men voted no. The Justice Bell became part of a nationwide push for women's suffrage, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Still, plenty of men and women thought women's suffrage would be a dangerous experiment.
Women shouldn't be dragged into the dirty pool of politics,
said Representative Thomas Girling of Minnesota. The U.S. Congress approved the amendment in 1919, but 36 states had to approve it. By August 1920, it needed one more state. In Tennessee, State Representative Harry Byrne read a letter from his mother. Dear Harry, hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. In the Tennessee House of Representatives, Byrne's yes broke a tied vote. The 19th Amendment was ratified. The celebrations began. At Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the Justice Bell's clapper was unchained. Mrs. Ruschenberger's teenage niece, Catherine Wentworth, rang the bell. Even after this victory, women and men of color still could not vote in some states. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed this discrimination. The Justice Bell is at the Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge National Historical Park in Pennsylvania. It will ring again on August 26, 2020 for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Amendment 19. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
Watch more videos like this one. Starting in 1910, some states in the West began to extend the vote for women for the first time in almost 20 years. Idaho and Utah had given women the right to vote at the end of the 19th century. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was written into law, allowing all women the right to vote as equal to their male counterparts, effectively ending the women's suffrage activities.
On November 2, 1920, more than 8 million women across the United States voted in elections for the first time.